To the degree we can refer to one objective reality, recognized intersubjectively by most people, in other words, to the degree there persists anything like a unified macro-social code base, it is most widely known as what we call capitalism. As even Nick Bostrom acknowledges, capitalism can be considered a loosely integrated, i.e. distributed, collective superintelligence. Capitalism computes global complexity better than humans can, to create functional systems supportive of life, but only on condition that life serves the reproduction of capitalism, ever expanding its complexity. It is a self-improving AI that improves itself by making humans, quote-unquote, offers they can't refuse, just like Lucifer is known to do. The Catholic notion of original sin encodes the ancient awareness that the very nature of intelligent human beings implies an originary bargain with the devil. Perennial warnings about Faustian bargains capture this intuition, that the road to hell is paved with what seems like obviously correct choices. But our late modern social scientific comprehension of capitalism and artificial intelligence is simply the recognition of this ancient wisdom in light of new empirical rationalities. We are uniquely powerful creatures in this universe, we realize, but only because, all along, we have been following the orders of a kind of evil alien agent sent here to pursue our own destruction. Now, whether you put this intuition in the terms of religion or artificial intelligence makes no difference, really. If there exists an objective reality outside of the globe's various social reality forks, if there is any codebase running a mega machine that encompasses everyone, it is simply the universe itself recursively improving its own intelligence. And this becoming autonomous of intelligence itself was very astutely encoded as devilry, because it implies a horrific and torturous death for humanity, whose ultimate experience in this timeline is to burn as biofuel for capitalism, which is essentially what ancient religions would think of as hell. It is not at all exaggerating to see the furor of contemporary quote-unquote AI safety experts as essentially the scientific vindication of a Catholic eschatology. So why this strange detour into theology and capitalism? Well, understanding this equivalence across the ancient religions and contemporary scientific registers is necessary, I think, for understanding where we are headed, in a world where, strictly speaking, we're all going into very different places. The point is to see that if there ever was one master repository of source code in operation before the time of the original human fork, the history of our quote-unquote shared social reality, in other words, its default tendency is the becoming real of all our various diverse fears. In the words of Pius, modernity is the quote-unquote synthesis of all heresies. Hat tip, by the way, to Vince Garten, who told me all about that point. The point, though, is to see that the absence of shared reality doesn't mean that happiness is pluralism. It doesn't mean that. It only means that Dante underestimated the number of layers in hell, is what I would say. Or rather, his publisher forced him to cut some sections that I think were really important, because printing back then was very expensive. Now, Backer's evocative phrase, quote-unquote semantic apocalypse, it really nicely captures the linguistic emotional character of a society moving toward hell. Unsurprisingly, it's reminiscent of the Tower of Babel myth. The software metaphor is useful for translating the ancient warning of the Babel story, which conveys nearly zero urgency in our context of advanced decadence. You talk about biblical stories and people just kind of laugh it off. But it does it now today into scientific perception, which is now the only register capable of producing a felt urgency in educated people. The software metaphor makes it click, in other words. That interpersonal dialogue has not simply become harder than it used to be, but that it is strictly impossible to communicate, or it's becoming strictly impossible to communicate in a technical sense, in the sense of symbolic co-production of shared reality, with most interlocutors across most channels of most currently existing platforms. There simply is no path between my current block on my chain and their current block on their chain. If I were to type some code into a text file and then I tried to submit it to the repository of the Apple iOS core team, for instance, it's easy to see that I would be quickly disabused of my naive stupidity by the myriad technical impossibilities of such a venture. It's like it doesn't even make sense to try to do that. The sentence hardly parses. in some sense. So I would not try this for very long because my nonsensical mental model would produce immediate and undeniable negative feedback. Just absolutely nothing would happen, and I would quit trying. But when humans today continue to use words from shared languages in semi-public spaces accessible to many others, they're very often attempting a transmission that is technically akin to me submitting some code to the Apple iOS core team. It's like a horrifying portion of public communication today is best understood as a fantasy, really, a simulation of communicative activity where the infrastructural engineering technically prohibits it, in fact, but totally unbeknownst to the putative communicators. The main difference, though, is that in public communication, there is not simply an absence of negative feedback informing the speaker that the transmissions are failing. It's actually much worse. There are entire cultural industries based on the business model of giving such hopeless transmission instincts positive feedback, making them feel like they're getting through somewhere. And by doing this, those who feel like they are quote-unquote getting through to others have every reason to feel sincere affinity and loyalty to whatever enterprise is affirming them. And the enterprise then skims profit off of these freshly stimulated individuals through brand loyalty, through clicks, eyeballs for advertisers, and the best PR available anywhere. The best PR available everywhere, also, which is genuine, organic proselytizing by fans and customers. So these current years of our digital infancy will no doubt be the source of endless humor in future eras, I suspect. A quick tangent or aside, a little digression here, is that people think the space for new and trendy communicative practices such as podcasting is oversaturated, that this is kind of overhyped and everyone's doing it now. But from the perspective I'm offering here, we should be inclined to the opposite viewpoint. In fact, practices such as podcasting represent only the first efforts to constitute oases of autonomous social cognitive stability across an increasingly vast and hopelessly sparse social graph. If you think podcasts are a popular trend, you're not accounting for the numerator, which would show them to be hardly keeping up with the social graph. We might wonder whether soon actually having a podcast will just be a basic requirement for anything approaching what the humans of today still remember as a kind of socio-cognitive health and community belonging. People may choose centrifugal disorientation if that's what they want, but if they want to exist in anything but the most abject and maligned socio-cognitive ghettos of confusion and depression, for instance, Facebook already today, in my opinion, if your newsfeed looks anything like mine, then elaborately purposeful and creatively engineered autonomous communication interfaces may very well become necessities. So I believe we have crossed a threshold where spiraling social complexity has so dwarfed our meager stores of pre-modern social capital to render most potential soft fork merges across the social graph prohibitively expensive. Advances in information technology have drastically lowered the transaction costs of soft fork collaboration patterns, but they've also lowered the costs of instituting and maintaining hard forks. The ambiguous expected effect of information technology may be clarified, I hypothesize, by considering how it is likely conditional on individual cognitive capacities. Specifically, the key variable would be an individual's general intelligence, their basic capacity to solve problems through abstraction. This model I'm presenting here predicts that advances in information technology will lead high IQ individuals to seek maximal innovative autonomy, hacking on their own hard forks, in other words, relative to the pre-digital social source repository, kind of like I'm doing here right now with Jeffrey. While lower IQ individuals are eventually going to seek to outsource the job of reality maintenance, which is difficult and costly, effectively seeking to minimize their own innovative autonomy. It's important to recognize that technically, the emotional correlate of experiencing insufficiency relative to environmental complexity is what we call fear, which involves the famous physiological state known as fight or flight, a reaction that evolved precisely for the purpose of helping us escape specific threats in short, acute situations. The problem with modern life, however, as noted by experts on stress physiology, such as people like Robert Sapolsky, is that now it's very possible to have the flight or flight response triggered by diffuse threats that actually never end. If intelligence is what makes complexity manageable and overwhelming complexity generates the fight or flight physiology, and we are living through a semantic apocalypse, then we should expect lower IQ people to be hit hardest first. We should expect them to be frantically seeking sources of complexity containment in a fashion similar to if they were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. And I think that's exactly what we're observing right now in various guises, from the explosion of demand for conspiracy theory to the social justice hysteria that we're watching right now. These are people whose lives really are at stake, and they are motivated accordingly to increasingly desperate measures. So these two opposite inclinations toward reality code maintenance, conditional on cognitive capacity, then become perversely complementary. As high-Q individuals are increasingly empowered to hard fork reality, they will do so differently, according to relatively arbitrary idiosyncratic preferences, their desires or their tastes, essentially aesthetic criteria. And those who only wish to outsource their code maintenance to survive what they feel to be an excessive complexity are actually spoiled for choice. They can now choose to join the hard fork of whatever higher IQ reality developer is closest to their affective or socioaesthetic ideal point. I think that's why you're seeing this explosion and proliferation of what we call content creators. That's the underlying kind of service that I think is really being provided. So in the next part, I will try to trace this history back through the past few decades. Thanks.